Hello and welcome to part 2 of my top 10 films that fucked me up as a child. In this video I'll be going over some of the films that terrified me as a kid to leave the rather disappointing individual you see or hear before you. If you haven't watched part 1, just click the annotation below and remember to subscribe to the Cinephiles, the great review show on YouTube that first came up with the idea for this video. At number 8 we have Whistle and I Will Come to You. Now you might hear the title and think that Whistle and I'll Come to You sounds like a low budget porn flick from the 70s, but this is in fact a television movie made by the BBC in 1968 which adapts a famous M.R. James short story for the small screen. For those unaware, in my opinion, there are two 20th century writers of short story horror fiction that have had a massive impact on the genre, be it on television or in cinema. One is of course H.P. Lovecraft, who wrote much more about physical, monstrous, indescribable horror, if I can even say indescribable, and the other is M.R. James, who wrote more in terms of the supernatural, immaterial, and is often seen as the father figure of the modern ghost story. While Whistle and I'll Come to You is relatively short, running at just under 45 minutes, it terrified me to a level as a kid that few full-length features did. The story revolves around a professor played by Michael Hordern, who is staying at an isolated inn at a remote location in England. During a few exchanges with some peripheral characters, we realise that the professor is an utter skeptic, who sees ideas of ghosts and demons as preposterous and born out of sheer ignorance. For the professor, these things just don't exist. As the film progresses, we see the professor taking long walks across the isolated landscape, with lonely beaches stretching off into the distance accompanied only by the whistling wind. During one of his walks, the professor trudges through a long since abandoned cemetery hidden by dead trees on the edge of a cliff. Intrigued, the professor explores and finds that erosion from the wind and sea has left a grave exposed hanging from the side of the cliff. In the grave he finds a small flute-like object carved from wood. Unafraid of ghosts and superstition and such things, he takes the object for later study. I don't want to ruin the story for you, all I'll say is that he finds an inscription on the flute and decides to use it. After this, the professor is hounded by dreams of being stalked by some horrific apparition. I'll stop right here, but there are two scenes that really stayed with me and still do to this day. The first is the scene of the apparition in the professor's dream, chasing him along the beach, and the second, well, go watch it and you'll know. All I'll say is that the sound of bedsheets rustling at night still leaves me slightly unhinged. It was released by the BBC on DVD a few years ago, and I really cannot recommend the film highly enough. It's one of many short ghost stories that the BBC has made over the years, and Whistle and I'll Come to You and The Signalman are two of the best, so go and watch them. Even talking about this film creeps me out, so time to move on. At number 7 we have The Legacy. Now this is a similar situation to Ruby because I haven't seen The Legacy since I was a kid. I think I was about 7 or 8 at the time, and my friend Andy, who I used to watch lots of scary films with, had taped this movie off of the TV. I think we watched it twice, but I really don't remember too much about it. Having done a little bit of digging, I can tell you that it was released in 1978, and online reviews seem to suggest that it's, well, crap. But it did stay with me, and it stayed with me to this day. Well, one part of the film has stayed with me since I was a kid, nonetheless. The Legacy follows a group of 6 individuals who have been invited by a billionaire called Jason Mount Olive to claim his legacy. You see, Jason is in fact dying, and wishes to pass on his inheritance to one of the 6 individuals. As far as I can remember, we see or hear very little from their host, under the guise that he is dying in a room upstairs, but nonetheless he makes rare appearances as one by one each of the guests meets a gruesome end. This is honestly about as much as I can remember, Whatever the legacy is, and whether it's the legacy that's really claiming them rather than the other way around, I'm sure I'll find out if I ever find a copy of this film. So if it's a film I can remember hardly anything of, why is it in this list? Well, there is one scene I can remember, and I remember it really well. One that had a very real effect on me. One that contributed to a very real fear of swimming. In the film, there's a scene where one of the guests goes into a swimming pool somewhere in the mansion. She's doing lengths, splashing around, enjoying the luxurious surroundings. At one point, she starts to dive down under the water. She does it a few times, surfacing when she wants, but the last time she dives down, she can't surface for air. It's as if the surface of the water has turned into a sheet of glass. As she's struggling to try and break through this barrier to get some air, she sees the distorted figure of Jason Mount Olive standing on a staircase, watching as the girl runs out of air and drowns. I don't really know if this is a scary scene. I don't know if it would work on me now if I watched it, but at the time this scene made me terrified to go back into a swimming pool. Well, the fact that around this time I nearly drowned in a swimming pool, it all added up to me staying away from swimming pools. Have no fear though, faithful listener. I finally conquered that fear when I was 21. But hey, it doesn't matter, does it? I got there in the end. Don't look at me like that. Well, I think it's time to move on. If you've seen Legacy, let me know what you think, because I would love to know if it truly is as rubbish as people are making out. At number 6, we have Hellraiser. Now, what I was doing watching Hellraiser when I was a kid is anybody's guess, but watch it, I did. I can remember the first time I attempted to watch it and wasn't successful. I managed to persuade my folks to rent the VHS from my local video shop. The reason I wanted to watch it was, number one, I had a picture of the evil entity known as Pinhead on the cover, looking really cool, and number two, it's called Hellraiser for Christ's sake, what's not to like? Anyway, myself and my friend popped the video on, but my dad sat with us and after about 10 or 15 minutes switched it off. Now, my father is a liberal thinker. He doesn't believe in the nonsense about films making kids violent, etc. But it had to be bad for him to switch it off. A few years later, I managed to finally see it down at a friend's, and boy did it stay with me. For those who don't know the plot to Hellraiser, it revolves around an antiquated metallic? It's not metallic, it's metallic. It's definitely metallic. Antiquated metallic puzzle box. You don't find out where this box comes from, but basically, if you pull the box around and solve it like a fucked up Rubik's Cube, something terrible happens. Hideous creatures from another dimension appear to take you away to a place where torture and pain will be your only existence, a never-ending agony. The majority of the film takes place in a house where a perverted and evil character called Frank has managed to escape his imprisonment by these demons and seemingly outwitted these creatures, or Cenobites as they're referred to. Interestingly, one of our users on our forums suggested Hellraiser as a haunted house film, which is a really interesting take on the movie, because it does actually have many of the conventions of the haunted house genre. I won't get into the whole plot as this isn't a full review, but Frank is basically a horribly twisted corpse and must kill to harvest body parts from his victims to make himself appear human again. There are a whole bunch of family orientated Shakespearean themes that makes this much more than a standard horror film. But let's get back to what really messed me up. Dear God, where to begin? So many moments filled me with abject terror. Frank's appearance in the first third of the film is really horrific. In fact, anything involving Frank at all is pretty terrifying. But the real fear came from Pinhead and the other Cenobites. These seemingly self-mutilated creatures had an effect on me in two main ways. Firstly, they had command of these chains with hooks in the end that seemed to come from the darkness and tear your flesh apart. And secondly, the idea that anyone could pick up this box without realising what it was and that these demons would come for you was horrifying. Most horror films for me at that point had always punished the bad, but here anyone, even the most pure-hearted, could end up being tortured for eternity. Of course, Hellraiser is a very famous film, So I can say that apart from a couple of effect shots, Tramp turning into a dragon, anyone, this film is still a visceral, disturbing experience. It really, really, really messed me up as a kid. Check it out if you're into that sort of thing, you sick and twisted individual. That's the end of part 2. Comment, rate, subscribe, and remember to jump over to areashiftybun.com where you can join our forums where we're talking about all sorts of different films and having a bit of fun. So, okay, let's try and keep this together, shall we? As we get even more messed up as we go into part 3. Thanks for listening.
Sí.